Hi everyone, good evening. It's October and we're still in the shed. Welcome to Conway Hall in quarantine month, so many months. This is our reweirding. Oh man, I had this all planned out. Sorry, start again. Hello everyone, welcome to Conway Hall. We are, if you don't know Conway Hall, we are a venerable and disrespectful establishment in central London. We put on talks that inspire people to think and think of a better world and just think about the world around us. Lots of great things like that. Obviously, we've been in quarantine, and Conway Hall at the moment is this shed in Lewisham. So welcome to my shed. This particular program is something I put together called Reweirding. It's just a way of looking at landscape and walking and nature and science and art and anything that really tickles our fancy. Just a way of seeing the world differently, which is kind of what we're all about. This has been one of so many online talks that we've done. How it generally works is I'll introduce a speaker in a moment, Gareth E. Rees. He'll speak for 45 minutes or so from his study. You're all there in your living rooms and baths and sheds and porta cabins, not sure where you are. He'll speak 45 minutes. During the talk or just after the talk, if you have a question, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom. You type your question in there and let us know whether you'd like us to open up your microphone so we can hear your question when you ask it. Or not. We're not going to put your camera on. It'll just be you asking questions directly to Gareth, because then it's just not two blokes chanting on all the time. Let's have a look. Yes. If you haven't donated to us, please do. Conway Hall is a charity. We exist to bring talks like this to the public, and it would be great if we can continue to do that. And follow us at Conway Hall or at Reweirding _. If you are of a tweeting persuasion, Unofficial Britain, Reweirding and Conway Hall are on Twitter. We use the hashtag Reweirding. I think that's all of my nonsense. Really excited about this talk. Really glad you've all been able to make it. The book is fascinating, Unofficial Britain, and I'm a big fan of it already. I'm really pleased that we can now go live to Hastings and Gareth Rees, Gareth E. Rees, the E is for erudite. Welcome to Conway Hall, Gareth.
Hello.
Right, and here's your talk, Unofficial Britain. Thanks for speaking, and over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. You joined me in Hastings in my psychogeographic lair. You can see in the distance here through my window Dungeness, which is in Kent, which is just visible from on the skyline of Hastings. I bought this painting off an artist called Mark Hollis, who did the cover of my second book, The Stone Tide, when I moved to Hastings, and it kind of haunted me from the wall for the entire time I was here. I was more familiar with this painting than I was with Dungeness itself. I didn't actually go and walk around it for about maybe another year or two, at which point this painting had embedded itself in my memory and in my consciousness of what the place was, a kind of spectral cubist dreamscape on the skyline. It's called the Ghost Box, which is a kind of a term that's used to describe a label of music called Ghost Box Records, which is ontological music, which is kind of a mix of 1970s and retro kind of futurism put into electronic music. And they do have songs that are about nuclear substations and things like that. So this really fed into what would eventually become this book, Unofficial Britain, which is about how structures like these, which are functional, maybe ugly, polluting, dangerous, feared, loathed, can become something more in the imagination, that they can haunt you from a distance, either with the stories and the lore that build around them, or their effect in your imagination and your feelings about them, whether you visit them later on in life or you grow up with them. A lot of the places I'm going to talk about in the book and also in this, and a few extra things here, are places that I grew up with, and they embedded themselves in my memories. And some of them were ugly and weird, like a chimney in the town of Glossop that I'm going to show you a bit later. but for good or bad, they entwine themselves around your memories. So Unofficial Britain effectively is a journey through a land of industrial estates and pylons and cooling towers and motorway service stations, the backs of hospitals, the strange edges of towns, those weird edge lands inside of towns as well, places where you live, the strange alleyways, the strange places that are odd to us, even though they might seem like familiar and everyday. You know, that strange roundabout that you know on the ring road, or the trading estate that always something strange is going on, or you sometimes see fire pouring out of it. The pylon that's on the brow of the hill that tells you you're on your way home. That factory that everyone protests about because of the toxins, and yet, you know, you played around there, the imaginative games that you know, maybe you had your first kiss there. That's the reality of where we live. 80% of us live in urban areas. And the reality of life are often these structures, and a lot of the events that happen to us that are important or exciting or emotional or tragic or funny happen in backdrops that aren't really picturesque or scenic or considered part of the official landscape of Britain. So that's where the idea for Unofficial Britain came from. Originally, it started as a website, and it was just a place where I wanted to put my writing about everyday spaces or unusual spaces that people overlook, and just see what happens. And I got subscribers and people who would post up their own stories as well. I began to get a sort of feel for an idea of a sort of alternative way of looking at landscape that took in magic and myth and folklore, which I'm very interested in, and notions of horror, and brought them into the space of chain store car parks and motorway service stations, because I think those places can be as eerie and as frightening and as interesting as meadows and lakes and woods. It's what I call the first green shoots of future folklore. So the idea of the book really is that I think that there are probably stories that are going to grow and last into the future that are happening now in these landscapes that we wouldn't consider folkloric. Because we tend to think of the idea of folklore as a thatched cottage in a village where there's a civil war battlefield, where the river Sedgwick runs red with blood. There's a knoll where a witch used to live. There are sort of streamers from May Day hanging. There are dances, and there are all sorts of rural customs and ancient traditions that go back hundreds of years. And that's what we think of folklore: the kind of crooked lane and the dark woods. All of those places are the stories that were told in oral tradition. So places that you would warn your children not to go, places where there were thieves and bears, and that's inevitably become entwined with what we call folklore. However, my sort of theory and what I feel is that has changed a lot. If you think about the Victorian era, in which there were factories and superstructures like railways and mine shafts and industrial upheavals that were quite modern and stark at the time, that must have felt like all the old ways were disappearing. Well, they in turn have become folkloric. So we think nothing weird about doing a haunted mine shaft or a haunted signal box in an old Victorian railway. We don't really think anything non-majestic about a mill. That we can have a haunted house, a terrace house, the Victorian house, which was very new at one time, can feel haunted to us because of all the stories from Dickens onwards, the ghost stories that we were grown up with. Now, my theory is that this is happening to the structures of the late 20th century, things like this, and places that you know as maybe as boring or anodyne spaces. I think they're becoming storied. There are things happening to them. There's some sort of magic that's beginning to seep out of them, which is what happens when humans get involved with any structures or any places. We kind of begin to grow ideas, and we begin to slowly sort of turn them into something that's more mythic and imaginative. I'm going to read a quick bit from the book just to show you what I'm talking about. So let me bring up this. Okay. So as I talk about, a lot of us complain that a lot of us have been lost in our society. Identikit hotels, chain stores and car parks have eroded our sense of place. Zones of transport like airports and railway stations and motorways make you feel like you could be anywhere in the country. Central heating, air conditioning and the supply of mass-produced goods flown from around the world have severed our connection to the seasons. There are fewer hubs where people can make friends and share stories. Screens, large and small, absorb our attention and detach us from what's happening around us. The artifacts of consumerism have pervaded every aspect of modern life. Now, all of this may be true, but to proclaim that there is no longer any myth, mystery, or beauty in our culture diminishes our everyday lived experience, and it underestimates the creative capacity of our minds. Our brains have essentially remained unchanged since the Stone Age. We still have the same instinct to seek patterns in chaos. We still yearn to make sense of the mysteries of existence, and we still tell stories to help us process the world. We still have an emotional attachment to places and objects, and these have not died beneath the concrete and tarmac of the modern world any more than they did beneath the iron and brick of the Industrial Revolution. And if you look closely enough, all landscapes can be fascinating, and any object, no matter what its material, can be freighted with meaning. A styrofoam chip sent whirling across a motorway by the cough of a truck exhaust can be as compelling as an oak leaf spinning in the breeze above a brook. They both ripple with the elements of the universe. They can tell a story or trigger an emotion, which is why it's possible to feel as much wonder and fear in a car park, power station, underpass, or waste ground as you can in a ruined castle or a dark, spooky wood. In modern terms, they are the ruined castle and the dark, spooky wood, where monsters and ghouls may lurk. Okay, so that's the gist of the book. That's from the introduction. So I'm going to sort of take you through a kind of exploration of how I started the book and how it came about. It all really begins with a pylon. At least for me, it did anyway. Back in the noughties, I moved to Hackney near the Lee Valley, right next to Hackney Marshes and Walthamstow Marshes. And it was there that I began to walk around with my dog Hendrix in a kind of strange landscape of broken down factories, railway lines, canals, trading estates, a kind of weird mix, football pitches, and a kind of mix of sort of retail and leisure, and also this ancient marshland that had been unchanged since the Ice Age. And as I was walking through this landscape, I started reading a book that was published in 1973 called The Unofficial Countryside by Richard Mabey, the nature writer. As you can see from the picture, it's pretty much the sort of former industrial landscape that you can imagine in the Lee Valley in Hackney. And it really was exactly the same kind of landscape. The book describes that the places at the edges of towns, which were not considered proper countryside, actually were as full of life as what you call the set pieces of the countryside, the actual deepest, darkest Devon and the moors and the meadows that we know. But actually, that nature could flourish anywhere there was a crack through the concrete, anywhere where there was sort of life, it would burst through. And he talked a lot about nature and the wildlife that would grow in these places. But as I was walking through the marshes, I kind of began to pick up a lot of human stories, the strange ravers who behind the reservoirs, the doggers in the car parks, the sort of Hasidic Jewish guys sneaking out for a crafty cigarette, the kind of businessmen wandering on the way to work, people looking kind of lost, stories of headless bears that used to roam the marshes apparently in the 1980s, sightings of saber-toothed tigers, sort of weird myths and stories that were clearly sort of not true, but I thought were interesting because they were growing in this place. And I began to think that if he could write about this as a sort of from a nature point of view, maybe I could write about it from a human point of view. What kind of human stories grow in the cracks? Which is where I got the idea for the Unofficial Britain website. So it was directly inspired by this. At the very same year, 1973, which was also the year I was born, this was published by Reader's Digest, which is this sort of huge tome of collected folklore of Britain. It's a real, masterpiece of its kind, full of pictures and full of stories. However, what's interesting about this book, and this is 1973 that it was written, is it says this at the end of the introduction. Much of Britain's urban folklore remains to be told, for it is largely folklore in the making. Now that many of us are generations removed from the countryside, new patterns are emerging. There are signs that our native lore, the product of many invasions and migrations, is to be enriched still further by that of more recent immigrations. The upheavals of modern times too have produced their own legends. On a long deserted Lincolnshire airfield, the scream of rending metal is said to be that of a wartime bomber that crashed there with a dying crew. The sounds of the Blitz are reputedly etched on the South London air, and train disasters are reenacted on their anniversaries. Phantom hitchhikers stand at crossroads, and ghostly lorries speed silently along the motorways. The more traditional roundheads and cavaliers, misty coaches and headless horsemen no longer ride alone. So that really is kind of the gist of what I'm talking about, and it's really good that that was mentioned sort of back in '73 when this book was made, because a lot of people tend to think that folklore is stuck in the past, and one of my aims is to try and bring it into the modern age. So let's go back to the pylon. I'm going to hopefully try and share the screen. I don't know if you saw the images. I'm going to try and do it again. So message me if you can't see this. You should be able to see this. This is a pylon that looks a little bit like a crown of thorns. This was the pylon that I say fell in love with. It was a kind of, I guess, platonic relationship, but I began to obsess over this one pylon that looked a little bit different than the others because it was positioned completely away from the parade of pylons. It was in these old Victorian filter beds that were used to filter water, and they were decommissioned in the 1960s. And they turned into a bit of a nature reserve, so that there were sort of sculptures and things around that people could look at, and there was more of a park really than an industrial site. So you have this sort of structure that is standing in the middle of this nature reserve that was unique and menacing. It looked like something like H.G. Wells would have come up with, or John Christopher's tripod trilogy. So I began to take photographs of it and walk around it and kind of get interested in it. At the very same time, I began to notice that people were lighting fires underneath it and smoking joints beneath it, and that other people were taking photographs as well. And it began to become a bit of a thing where I'd just go on Twitter or something and someone else would have taken a photograph of it. So it began to sort of attract this kind of local lore. I began to imagine it had a sort of feminine quality to it as well as this obvious phallic one. And I got sort of strange thoughts about it, this sort of strange sexiness to the pylon. Then what happened was they came and they took it down. So they were cleaning up for the Olympics and they decided to remove the pylon. So they pulled it apart like a cooked lobster and it was gone. And I began to think, well, this was so fundamental to my experience of that place. Even though it wasn't a beautiful oak tree or something wonderfully natural, it was something that was important to me. And that began my thoughts about objects ugly and industrial and how they can have importance and poetry and meaning. And I kind of thought of that at first, that I was being a bit strange, but then I discovered there were other people who were doing this kind of thing. So I'm going to show you, let's double check. Should be able to see that. So this is a pylon god by Maxim Griffin, an artist that I met through Twitter. You can see here he's kind of brought the landscape together with the Neolithic sort of standing stone circle, and combined it with this kind of sort of pylon sun god. And this was kind of interesting to me because I started looking obviously into the etymology of the pylons, and they were actually originally designed in 1920s by Sir Reginald Bloomfield as a sort of lattice tower that was supposed to look effectively like a pyramidion, like an ancient Egyptian obelisk. And obviously the word pylon means gateway, and the pylon gateways in Egypt were gateways to the Nile, and the sun would rise between them. So there was this kind of sun-based element to them in the first place. Let's read a bit from the book about it. In 2010, a Lancashire-based group of free thinkers known as New Horizons published a YouTube video linking the obelisk design of the British electricity pylon to the shadowy secret society known as the Illuminati. According to the group, the pylons are penis icons, representative of the sun god Ra, designed by the Illuminati to litter the cities and towns of the world, flaunting the hidden powers of the ruling bloodlines. Why else, they argue, would such a specific design, which has no practical necessity, have been chosen, if not as a demonstration by the ruling elites? To illustrate their theory, they include clips of a 1991 advert for National Power, which shows sentient pylons crackling into life, tearing their legs free of the earth and striding across the landscape. The ad culminates with a pylon standing on the cliffs of England, saluting the sun, or more specifically, say New Horizons, the sun god Ra. So here we have this kind of strange conspiracy theory around pylons. You've got artists making sort of pylon god pictures. I came across this. This is by James Knight. He does these sort of pictures of a dream. He had a series of them online. And here he has got sort of Christ on the pylon. Richard Littler, who created the Scarfolk website, did the satirical one about the Scarfolk made pylon dance, which is a kind of joke about some 1970s health and safety and that kind of thing. However, it is interesting that they turn this folkloric idea of the pylon, I think, maybe is born out. Certainly it felt like that in the marshes with the pylon that I used to kind of hang around with. Right, so anyway, the pylon was how it started. And I began to write about the industrial edgelands and about some of the myths and stories that we're collecting there. And I created a book called Marshland, which was the first sort of beginnings of what I'm doing now, really. And I touched on some of the ideas in Unofficial Britain, because it was kind of fundamental to my ideas. After I'd written that, I moved to Hastings, so moved into the lair of the power station, and I began work on a new book called The Stone Tide. And ostensibly this was about Hastings, and the idea was to try and talk about the many occultists and weird characters who came to Hastings and kind of seemed to be transformed by the place, and all the strange nooks that existed in the town that had these folkloric stories in them. There's much more a traditional, what I would call a traditional folkloric town. There's old Tudor beamed houses, and there's proper witch stories and festivals and the Green Man. So it's much more in the realm of what you think is folklore. But even so, I started to notice strange things about the town. So, for example, there was this idea that Aleister Crowley cursed the town, which was a kind of urban myth, really, rather than a folkloric myth. And that urban myth is probably not true, having read the biography of him in his time in Hastings. And he loved the place, and he really was just a sort of old heroin addict, playing a lot of chess. I don't think he was that disgruntled. However, what happened was that became a way that the town explained a lot of what happened to it as it declined as a seaside resort, and a lot of problems began to emerge socially as the guest houses emptied and people from London were moved down. The councils of London were just sort of getting rid of people and moved them to Hastings, and people were dislocated and had certain problems, and this began to make the town a much more troubled place that often went down to this curse. And I began to think of that as an idea of an urban place that has this storyline that it's picked up. That may not be true, but that defines a town and how it is. And that got me thinking a little bit about that with other structures. So that was The Stone Tide. As I was writing this, I began to, sort of as a drunken thing first, I started to walk around supermarket car parks, which was really the germ of what I'm writing about in Unofficial Britain. Car park life started as a sort of strange drunken walk through my Morrisons on the way home from the pub. Where I thought, do you know what, I write about the place, and why is the Morrisons car park not as good as anywhere else? So I started to meander through, and I found all sorts of stuff there, like a crashed Mercedes that had the number 1066 on the number plate. There was a fox in the petrol forecourt. There were kind of strange bangs and clangs, which I assume were from the night shift, but that were kind of echoing, resounding around the empty car park, giving a kind of an eerie sense that in this empty space there was things happening. Strange characters lurking in the perimeter. It was more full of life than I would thought, and it was as interesting as anywhere else I've walked. So I thought I would try that as an idea. I would go to car parks across Britain and walk around them, and I deliberately chose sort of retail car parks, the bits outside Morrisons and B&Q and Marks and Spencer's and retail parks, to see if these sort of structures had any kind of resonance. And I kind of did, because what happened was I discovered two types of essence to car parks and places like car parks and shopping centres. The first was that they are layered with stories, because they've been around so long. We all know supermarket car parks, and we've lived in them long enough, and we've lived around them, for them to actually fill up with murder and rape and violence and intrigue. And a lot of stuff happens in them. You can Google car park violence, car park murder. There's a lot of stuff happens in car parks. They're a hotbed of human emotion and violence and rage and racism and all sorts of consumer madness. So they are actually interesting. For example, a priest was laying dead in a car for 3 days in a car park. There was a sectarian hit that took place outside of Sainsbury's in a car park in Northern Ireland. There was a fatal fight between road rage by pensioners. So that began to make me think, well, these places can be storied. There's another element to it, though, and that is that everything we know and we walk around supermarkets and shopping centres, they're all built on something. Usually they're built on something else. They're either built on a former use in a town, but they're also built on sort of edgeland areas and brownfield sites, places that had layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of uses in the past, maybe before we even knew what the use was, or prehistorical uses. And so I got the sense that there was something deeper underneath the surface. So, for example, in Leith, the Asda car park is in the dockland, and the verge around the outside is all this sort of shingle is made out of shells, and there's an actual ship moored on the car park side. You've got a leat, like it's a kind of waterway that runs through a Plymouth car park, a Plymouth retail park, and that was built by Sir Francis Drake, and that still kind of exists. You can walk up it, and it's still there. It's all walled off, and it's right in between B&Q and KFC and M&S as this sort of historical fragment that's been trapped in amber. There's a Lancaster Sainsbury's that has effectively been knocked down out of an old Victorian public bath and then built back up using some of the structures. So it's like the ghosts and the bones of the old buildings still exist in places that we think of maybe as new or anodyne or modern. I began to find things like, so a lot of standing stones and strange sculptures that would exist on roundabouts and in retail parks and in shopping areas that seem to hint at an idea that there's a kind of Neolithic origin to commerce, that these standing stones, like the beginning of 2001 Space Odyssey, it was from the moment we learned to kind of farm, suddenly what would happen was we'd end up with commerce and buying and selling goods and trading, which would end up with shopping centres. But even though this is an obvious Neolithic kind of sort of homage, you'd also get images like this, which is a proper 2001 Neolithic fusion, where you get these obelisks of retail rising up on the skyline. I began to think of, what about a lot of these places that we consider as retail or industrial? What about if they're used or viewed in the same way as maybe the people use Stonehenge or maybe saw old causeways? They have the same majesty and effect on the psyche. And with the proliferation of roundabouts and sculptures in these places that do seem to hint at pagan structures or pagan ideas or Neolithic ideas, maybe there was something deliberately going on here. Maybe these are our new sites. Maybe this, this has taken Leighton Mills retail park. Maybe that is the Stonehenge of, that will be dug up in 1,000 years' time. So all of these ideas were pooling together into kind of what this book would be about, really. So I tried to connect these ideas to a whole load of different kind of structures. So the book's split into pylons and ring roads and roundabouts, estates, breweries, factories, nuclear power stations, flyovers, underpasses, motorways, motorway junctions, industrial estates and trading estates, multi-storey car parks, hospitals, both the kind of inside of hospitals, which are strange and sometimes quite liminal. They're just these networks of corridors, but also they're weird rear spaces and side spaces, which can be quite chaotic and a bit mad. So I'll have a look at what I've got. I think I've got about 10-15 minutes. So I'm going to zoom through a few things with you, and hopefully you can see all this. I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of some of the locations that I kind of find interesting. Let's try share screen again. This is the Cowell roundabout in Fife. So linking on to the shopping centre roundabouts, you get these capsules of local identity in roundabouts, certainly in new towns like Glenrothes, which is where this is, where these huge causeways are built almost like an Neolithic structure. So this was a standing stone circle with 7 different stones. It was actually a facsimile of a nearby site, which was a genuine site called Balpark Henge. So this was a reflection of the two. However, when I went to Balpark Henge, it was really just a series of posts in the grounds and a tourist sign explaining what it would have been when it was built and what it would have been like. And I kind of thought that this roundabout was more interesting. I felt this was fulfilling its function. The stones were alive. It was a place that was a landmark. It was there to impress as drivers came from each end of the road. There's 4 roads here, so it's like a crossroads. So everyone can see it as they come in. It's fundamental to the culture of the town. It's there to tell people where they are and to sort of inspire some kind of awe and majesty. And I felt like this kind of place is as interesting to me, maybe, as the original sites that it was supposed to inspire it. That's Balpark Henge there. You've got a couple of stones, but mainly it's a suggestion of what it would have been. So that's one of the sites in the book. That's a close up there. This is an estate in Grimsby called the Nunsthorpe Estate. And on the edge of this estate in the early 80s, a guy called Robin Furman was in his house and he saw a ghost. It was a nun on his landing, dressed in her habit. As he kind of moved close to her, she disappeared. He decided to get involved in parapsychology because of this, so inspired was he, that he graduated with a degree in psychology and philosophy and started something called the Grimsby Ghostbusters, which was a whole bunch of his friends, including a microbiologist, a photographer, a computer consultant, an electronics engineer, and his son. And they had a call-out vehicle, which was a 1959 Austin Princess, formal male limousine, and they had a weapon of choice, the Robo-Ghost, which was an electronic detection machine constructed from an ACOL computer. To make it even more brilliant, they were accompanied by Robin Furman's 14-stone Newfoundland dog called Ben, which gave it kind of Scooby-Doo twist. And their cases, he wrote a book about this, and their cases included a semi-detached home where a woman was possessed by an ancient Sumerian demonic entity named Pazuzu, a car auction house in Cleethorpes haunted by a man who hanged himself in a ghost train on the theme park that used to occupy the site, and a haunted shoe shop in Wellergate in Grimsby, where the manageress saw an elderly man in Rupert the Bear trousers and a woolly jumper walk between the aisles and vanish through a wall. So in Grimsby, in this particular estate where the nun appeared, this is it's called Nunsthorpe because it was built on formerly religious lands. And the sightings in the 1970s and the 1980s were two different poltergeist events, both with this kind of monk-like figure appearing. And they're terrifying the people to the point where they could have had to leave the house. And that kind of interested me as an idea that we think of haunted houses as old Edwardian, Victorian, Tudor mansions or houses or cottages, crumbled down old things in the middle of the moor. But what if, why was there such an explosion of these hauntings in council estates and suburban housing estates in the 1970s and 1980s? There were so many of them, and we know from from various films like the Enfield poltergeist and the one in The Conjuring, the one up in Yorkshire, Pontefract. There was another similar kind of event there, and they become so saturated in our imaginations that actually I think if you do a poltergeist film now, it really does have to be a kind of council house or a kind of modern built house. They've almost become the ghost of the modern estate. So I kind of went to this estate in Grimsby to think about it and think, well, is there anything inherently spooky about it? And so I'll just read a bit from the book where I go to it. At the top of Langton Drive, the site of the second poltergeist incident, stood the Nunsthorpe Tavern, its empty car park barricaded by a metal chain with spikes, echoing what the little girl described the monk wearing. Adjacent was a row of shops, outside which the bollards were tilted as if a beast had gone berserk. Behind it was a patch of wasteland strewn with flats of cardboard and white carrier bags that shivered in the breeze. The sign for Langton Drive was badly rusted, while the sign for the pub, creaking on a pole by the road, was blank, a totally white space overlooking an empty car park. An estate agency billboard said, "Could you run this pub?" It made me assume the place had closed down until I saw a figure in the doorway, cast in the glow of an external security light, smoking a cigarette. His facial features weren't visible, and he didn't move as I crossed beneath the blank pub sign, though I was certain he was watching me. Perhaps he was not of this world. As Robin Furman says in his book, it makes you wonder how many times people meet ghosts that don't even realise it. I was fully aware that my perspective was under the influence of stories about dissolved priories, faceless nuns, disturbed monks and poltergeists. What I'd read about Nunsthorpe had fermented in my imagination to produce these sensations, intensified by expectation and enchanted by a chilly December twilight and the thinning of the day. But isn't this how we experience a place? Where a place is more than bricks and mortar, more than a map, more than a bunch of articles about social deprivation and Britain's worst towns. A place is made of stories you read and rumours you hear. It is made of prejudices and anxieties shaped by your past experiences. It is an atmosphere, a synchronicity of light, sound, smell, texture and temperature. It's a memory triggered in the deep recesses of your subconscious, a horror from your past, an anxiety from your present, a desire for your future. It is a projection of your state of mind, which can make manifest the invisible, animate the inanimate, and imbue even the dullest modern house with a sinister energy. So that was Grimsby. In the book, I also talk about factories. This is a picture of me in the 1980s with my brother playing in the field opposite our house. That chimney you can see in the backdrop is now demolished, but was a fundamental structure for me. It was the anchor for my place. My house was literally 20 yards in front of that. And that was a place that became entwined in my sense of what the town was. It was only built 3 years before I arrived in 1979, 1980. So it actually was a new structure, but to me as a child, it seemed like something that had always been there. And that interested me writing this book when I went back and looked at it. And it got demolished recently. So the chimney is no longer there. When I went back to look at the place, the whole place got fundamentally changed in character. So that's one of the ideas of the book, is that a lot of the places that we now vilify or have been vilified will maybe become cherished to the point we'll be nostalgic or sentimental about their disappearance. Another walk in the book is through the M32, where it cuts through Bristol. So this is a picture of a couple of friends of mine, Nick Edwards and Mark Hollis, walking through an underpass, heading, if you can see right at the end of there's a little box, which is this shrine that we found. So this is the interchange of Junction 3 of the M32, where the motorway flows through St. Werburgh's and St. Paul's of Bristol. And it's a really busy, thunderous junction. It's like an elevated roundabout, big concrete circle above this deep river of a link road motorway that caused a lot of problems in Bristol, splitting aside communities, causing all sorts of pollution and noise and social upheaval. And yet in the middle of it are these kind of strange totems, folkloric ideas, like this shrine here, which had little bits of seeds and stuff placed in it. And it's a sort of bit of a palimpsest. If people keep adding to it. So here it's got Extinction Rebellion and this strange hand thing. Later on, it's been painted pink, and basically people add things to it all the time. So it's become a kind of, I guess, an unofficial local totem that's gained its own energy and life. On the top, overlooking the motorway, again, this is a completely random walk. I discovered this doll that had been sort of twined with the struts of the fence that separated the pathway from the roundabout going around it. So it's a really noisy, smoking, thundering, vibrating place right above the M32. And yet here we have this, what possibly was a memorial to someone who died. It was strange. It didn't look like that. And the flowers were there, but there was no notes or anything else with it. So I don't know, it could have been, but the idea was more that these sort of natural totems are left in this place. Maybe think about how people see these structures, even if they don't like them. There's a kind of a dialogue going on between sort of nature and concrete that I found really interesting. When I went back there for another visit recently, this wasn't there when I wrote the book, but they'd actually shoved a big standing stone outside of the roundabout. And this was in the book. I talk about how it reminded me of a ceremonial sort of site, an old sort of Neolithic site. Just because of the way the structures work, it's a circular, it's got these tunnels going through, it's got votive offerings in the middle, and it's in the middle of this long causeway. But they actually put up this standing stone, which I don't know, it was brand new, so I couldn't work out what it was supposed to be commenting on, or whether it was linked to my ideas, the same thing that I've been thinking about the junction. And on the walls, I discovered these sort of strange, I guess, esoteric book recommendations. So we've got P. Manly Hall, he has the truth. So he was a lecturer, astrologer and mystic, best known for his work, The Secret Teaching of All Ages in the 1920s. And then Arnold Ehret, who was the sort of godfather of naturopaths, natural health, alternative health, known for developing the mucusless diet healing system. So weird stuff to find in the middle of this of an underpass, to find esoteric book recommendations, votive offerings, flowers, seeds, and a kind of sort of subculture that I think says something about the way we respond to these spaces. So one of the other journeys in the book is through industrial estates, which are other sort of slightly chaotic edgeland spaces, that are parts of town that are all a little bit confused for people because no one really knows where they begin or where they end. This is the Dellingbourne trading estate in Greenock, west of Glasgow. And here is the lair of a person called Catman, who since the 1970s has been seen like a sort of Spring Hill Jack figure leaping out at people as they went home from the pub. Seen as an urban myth, but then in the 1990s there were more sightings of him, and in the noughties, at the advent of sort of phone cameras or people having cameras and the digital cameras on them, there began to be footage of him. He was said to be maybe a Russian sailor that jumped overboard, and then began to sort of eke out an existence in the trading estates of Greenock. Other people say that what happened was he was a cat man, which is a kind of a sort of homeless guy who, in the time of the shipbuilding years, would have been there, or the dock years, would have been there to kind of keep the rat population down by feeding the cats and looking after the cats. They thought maybe he was a cat man gone rogue, like a Japanese soldier still fighting the war in the jungle long after the war's over. He's still sort of sorting out the rats in the industrial estates, the Docklands of Greenock, and no one's really told him to stop. Or is he a prank? Is this a whole piece of theatre, of local theatre? No one knows. The council tried to look for him. There've been social services looking for him. Is he a myth or is he real? These are the pictures of him that exist on the internet, always in the same kind of area of the industrial estate. So in the book, I do go and take a look at this area, which is kind of, he lurks around this back area here, which is sort of behind the bus depot. Along this corrugated iron fence, there are bits open where you can see this sort of inner scrubland, which is full of old bits of gas canisters and strange bivouac caves that I don't know whether they're deliberate or they're just from the trees falling down and becoming grown with moss. It's where people who've nicked stuff chuck away the wallets after they've taken the cash. So I found this this wallet there as well, all sorts of debris. As I came out of that particular spot, I then confronted this Catman's Greenock, which is this brilliant film about the Catman. And it was fascinating that I could actually find the artworks that people were making about this industrial estate actually in the industrial estate itself. And it really backed up my idea. It's in the book that we are now telling stories about these sorts of places, and they're becoming mythic, and they're becoming folkloric, and they're becoming important to people. And we should kind of look at them in new ways, and that's not necessarily to fetishize them, but to understand them a bit more, and to almost embrace the new kind of folklore that may be a little bit wonky and weird, but is ours at the end of the day. We'll stop sharing that now. Right, so I don't know whether I think I've done 45 minutes. Should I do any more?
You got more in the tank, Gareth. I think you should.
I've got more in the tank, then that's fine. All right, so I'll carry on. The next place I'll take you to is in Wrexham, which is where my dad comes from. Okay, so I wrote Car Park Life, deliberately avoiding multi-stories because I thought, well, they're big brutalist structures, people don't take photographs of them. They're quite interesting in themselves, so I thought I'd avoid that because they're too interesting. However, for this book, I thought, no, let's go for it, because multi-stories are concrete castles that are an outpost of most urban areas. Most towns and cities have one. They're almost like the Norman castles that kind of proliferate in every place where we kind of gather. And they've become old and worn. A lot of them are being slated for demolition because they're not being used anymore. And people are protesting. People say they're beautiful structures. People feel that they're going to lose something without them. Other people hate them. But a lot of people, even when they hate them, they're a big presence in the towns. So I started to look at this idea of multi-stories and what kind of effect they have. Their kind of inherent creepiness and ghostliness, something about the acoustics and the microclimate, the way that the sound barrels off the concrete, the stairwells with the kind of the smell of urine and the kind of things going on, the fact that they're used by lots of different groups of people at various times of day or night as an unofficial places to get drunk or to hang out or to rendezvous. They're used in films a lot for scenes of murder or fear. So they've become kind of a cultural phenomenon. There's something very unique about the inside of a space like that. This is the one. This is called St. Mark's Road, multi-story in Wrexham. It's actually just gone under the hammer for auction. If anyone fancies buying it, I don't know whether they're going to demolish it. But it's a classic concrete layer cake. This is the sort of thing I think of when I think of multi-story. But the weird thing about this one is also a church. So the multi-story was built onto the shopping centre. The shopping centre was built on the site of a church, and the church agreed to have the church knocked down if it could be fused and reintegrated with a brand new building in the shopping centre. So you can see on the right here, that's the view of the car park. You've got this incredible concrete structure, which is the church religious structure, that's part of the actual multi-story itself. That's weird enough on its own. And then when I went inside, there was all this kind of sort of upside down cross stuff going on, and the whole place had a strange religious feel to it. I thought, well, maybe these places are cathedral-like, but they're like the ruins of cathedrals, and they're places that have the strange marks of those who dwell in them. There's all these signs of decay, this sort of ectoplasmic ooze pouring down the windows and collecting in pools. And the atmosphere in there was genuinely eerie. And I was thinking about how the way that these stories are becoming mossy and kind of overgrown and crumbling and flaking, and that gives them a certain kind of poetry. And also in the book, I talk about some multi-stories, like one in Dundee, that's built on a graveyard, and it's said to be haunted. And there's all sorts of stories of a girl crying. There's also been quite a few sightings of ghost suicides, people seeing people go to the edge and jump and not jumping. So I think that they're like the haunted castle where the headless man wanders the battlements, or the white lady. I think we're getting there a little bit with multi-stories. I also look at hospitals, and hospitals I find interesting because, again, they're a structure that we're all sort of familiar with in our own way, because we're usually born in one, or we've been ill in one, or we've been rushed to one, or one of our relatives has been ill. And they're places that we don't think about until we're in a lot of trouble, and then suddenly they loom large in our psyches, and they become extraordinarily detailed. All the smells and textures of a hospital become really full on and present in your mind, and they become mythic structures, because all of these things that happen to us in hospitals, these huge fundamental events, are stories that really exist in our mind. They don't exist in a real place because it's wiped down, it's all anodyne, it's completely clean, it's wiped away, the machinery is taken away, and the site of your melodrama is reset for someone else. So really, all you remember is what you felt at the time. That's the only memory that lasts. The hospital itself is a blank slate. And when I thought about that, I thought, well, maybe hospitals are like these theatres of memory, where really they're huge anthologies of events that don't really mark themselves on the actual walls or on the corridors, but that do exist in our imaginations and our minds, which makes them kind of mythic. This one is I took a walk around Bethlehem Hospital, which was Bedlam originally, and we all sort of know the stories of Bedlam and the kind of the cruelty, and it was a sort of byword for madness and despair. This is a site in South London that got moved to in the 1930s, and so it looks like a kind of classic modern hospital, but like modern hospitals, it's got weird sort of aerials sticking out and cones everywhere. While they've got the original structure, they're constantly being improvised, bits of plastic and bolted on chaotic spaces, mobile phone masts and aerials. To the left here, you can see the occupational therapy building, which is, because this is still a hospital for patients, obviously, who are undergoing a lot of trauma, and they're expressing it through the art that sort of spills out onto the walls themselves. So these are the artworks on the occupational therapy department, and they're full of sort of fantastical figures and folkloric kind of characters and bits of the imagination and faces and emotions. So that I kind of like this idea that even on sort of what you would call a boring space, there's this kind of these stories that are being told. So it's almost like this Bethlehem Hospital, it's seeping out of the walls. There's a ship of fools going over the edge of the roof, and then later on, as I was wandering around the site, there's this sort of pan-like figure in the gardens as well. And so I was wondering about that as an idea of hospitals, because of the stories that we tell about them. Maybe they're going to be the new kind of mythic sites. A final thing now. So at the end of the book, I do a tour of the. I don't do a tour. Can it be called a tour? I think it is. It's a trip up the M6, which loads of people have done. But I went up the M6 with no reason to go up the M6 at all, other than to go up it and to be on it. I thought, why don't I experience the M6 as a place, and rather than have a destination, just stay on the M6 for 2 or 3 days, staying at service stations, at days in hotels, and just exploring every service station and just enjoying it as a thing. Because a lot of people talk about unplaces and non-places, the idea that a place can be devoid of any kind of cultural context, like airports, where there isn't any sort of sense of time or place. They exist outside of those things. They're places of transit. They're liminal spaces that are not. You could be anywhere in the world, and you wouldn't really know it. And they say this about motorways, and that maybe was true when the M6 was built, but I've got a theory that it's not. They're not. They're places. They are real places, and the M6 is different to the M1, and the M1 is different to the M25. And depending on what your life has been like and where you've lived, there'll be set stretches of motorway that are important to you. There'll be service stations you remember. services you remember from when you were a kid, or places where incidents happened. The motorway's been around for a long time, and it too has gone crumbled and it's gone storied and gnarled. And when you drive up the M6, you take an incredible amount of the countryside. You can take in a whole array of landscapes, and they do bleed into the motorway, into your experience of driving it, whether you're driving through on top of Spaghetti Junction in the middle of Birmingham, or you're kind of cruising around the sides of mountains in North Cumbria, heading towards Scotland. One of the most famous sites on the M6 is this, which is Fortin Services, Lancaster Services, which is this iconic sort of spacey tower that was built in the 60s by a top-rank organisation who were really experimental with their architecture. And this, apparently the Beatles had dined in here, and it was of course celebrity at the time, and it was a future. People were going to eat in these great sky restaurants over this new super highway where everything was going to be clean and fresh and new and modern. That was the dream, but as we know, these things don't turn out like that. And this is now a restaurant that can't be accessed, and it's become again another crumbling icon, the likes of which I talk about in the book. But because it's unofficial Britain, even this to me probably is too official. It's almost become embraced as the picturesque. So I took a walk around the outside, and there's all sorts of sort of strange stuff there. There's a guy. This guy's been selling CB radios here since Valentine's Day 1990, I think. And he has all sorts of kind of stories and characters sort of moving around this area. Behind the truck area here, there's this edgeland sort of bit of grass and trees, the usual thing at the perimeter of the service station. As I tracked along, I discovered this, I call it concrete henge. It was an enclosure that was locked and has barbed wire to make sure you can't get in or out. And it's got these 3 concrete structures that are covered in moss that I couldn't work out what they were for, whether they were an older structure that had been ruined, whether they were supports for something that was being built. It was like this inexplicable object that was just right there in the middle of this sort of iconic service station. I don't think, when I've talked about it, a few people have walked that part of the perimeter and seen it, so I didn't really know what it was, and I couldn't work out on Twitter. But I didn't really care. I mean, if someone told me what it was, fine. But I found that exciting, that this sort of unexplainable thing. As you walk further along the perimeter past the hotel, it's what's extraordinary about Fortin is you get the threshold between the services and the countryside is very stark. It's literally that bit of path, and then you're in White Car Lane. You're in this winding rural landscape that smells of cow shit, and you can hear sheep bleating. And it's just that I found it a sort of an interesting thing, because the motorway is like a place that you exist in. It's like a building, and very rarely are you allowed to seep through the edges of that motorway service station into non-motorway land, mainly so people don't take shortcuts, don't go off and find a pub or find some cheaper food. So the motorway wants you to stay in its kind of motorway world. The motorway world is motorway world. It could only be British motorway world and nowhere else. So that kind of made me think that a motorway can be a place. I'm just going to finish with just a sort of a final thought, and just read the final bit from the book, just to kind of sum up what I'm talking about. So I talk about how the places I've been in this book. I drove on dual carriageways and ring roads and motorways. I parked in multi-stories and I slept in hotel chains. I delved into childhood recollections and family history. And what I learnt on this journey is that everything changes, and yet little does. Landscapes overlay landscapes in ever-turning cycles. The flyover where a viaduct once stood. The Victorian workhouse that became a hospital. The steel works on the side of a monastery. The burial cairn surrounded by a busy interchange. Motorway earthworks that rise along their Bronze Age predecessors. The pretty bend on the river that became a dirty dockland, then a ramshackle trading estate, then an artist hub, then an estate of luxury waterside high-rises. And then after each new manifestation replaces the old, it too becomes worn, decayed, and saturated with nostalgia, to the point where some mourn its passing as much as others once lamented its coming. And so the cycle turns. Right, thanks. Is that all right, Scott, and everyone?
I think so. What does everyone think? So, you've had some questions. I'm still haunted by Catman, so I can't think of any questions or anything to say myself. Really enjoyed it though, Gareth, thank you. Yeah, brilliant, thanks. It resonated with people. and apparently you're scintillating, which I think we all knew anyway. So if you have a question or a comment, or maybe share a really quick story, because I'm sure a lot of people are going to have a lot to say, but either please put your hand up or put your question into the Q&A, and we can, if you wish, open up your microphone and you can talk to Gareth. I know Beck Lambert had something to ask, so I hope she's okay with me opening up her microphone. And we will see.
Sorry, I'm not good with technology, am I, Scott?
Yeah.
I can hear you, so you're fine.
All right. Yeah. Hi, Gareth. Really brilliant. Really loved that. I'm just a wee question. So I was just wondering if you've got any thoughts about a potential new book, and if so, if you're allowed to perhaps tell us what that might entail.
I've got some ideas, but they're not formulated yet. So the way I do things, I don't really get ideas unless I really believe this. I really think you have to go to places and absorb them and let accident and weirdness come to you. So what I'll start to do over the next, it's been a bit of a weird time, obviously. But I'll start to, the good thing about it is I don't think you're fine going around service stations and stuff. So I'm basically, I just wander around and see what happens, and maybe something will come to me. I've got an idea. I'd like to maybe find a structure that exists and maybe just do a whole book about that one life and one structure. So rather than just to see how deep I can go, see how far I could go into a motorway interchange or a viaduct or something, and see what kind of life exists. I'm interested in, this book is very much about human stories, but I'm getting more and more interested in the idea of the object itself having its own life and identity, and without the human stories, and also maybe some of the natural things that go on around it. Like an object has more about it than just our human perception of it, and that there's actually, it could be something to write that isn't just about human stories. So that's sort of my idea. But other than that, no, I haven't really thought about it.
No, that sounds really interesting, and I totally get what you're saying about you have to go and experience places. I'm exactly the same. So, but congratulations on the book. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's given me really food for thought. So thank you.
Nice one. Cheers, Beth.
No worries.
Mark Nunn, you've got a comment in the Q&A. If you'd like to speak, I've just opened up your microphone.
I mean, I can see some questions here. Oh, there's Mark there.
Yeah, I am. The question was in the text. Hi, thanks for a great talk. That's really interesting. I read your book a few years ago about the Lee, and I live very close, and I walk and run around there. And I was just wondering, for my own personal curiosity, do you have a picture of your original pylon in context? I'm wondering if I could identify it.
I think someone else asked. Yeah, I do, but not here. And what's really annoying is in my old Dropbox that my ex-wife had. So, but I think maybe the dirty pylon pictures are what did it. So I will try and find it, maybe put it up on my Twitter or something. It was the one. It was in the filter bed. So when you walk between where the fish heads used to be, that long rampart, it used to be standing right at the edge between the sort of fish heads and the filter beds and the wall. And then they moved it over the wall. They got rid of it because I think it was getting in the way. Although I thought it made it better. But yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Hayley Dunning had a question.
Yes. Hello. Thanks for the great talk.
Thank you.
So at the end there, you were talking about kind of a cycle of, a place becoming new things like new flats and stuff, but then that eventually degrades and new things will be built on top of that. Do you think any of the structures you visited or you looked into will still exist in thousands of years, like Stonehenge?
That's what I thought. So, I mean, some of them are already like that. I mean, who knows what's happening to that car park in Wrexham, but maybe that will be demolished and something else will be there. And that was that church and that car park, and that was the church that came before it, and who knows what that site was before. I think, well, I think when all's said and done, when everything's on fire and it's all coming to an end, I think what will be left will be these lines of, there's a bit in the book where I talk about this. I talk about because in Glasgow, there was a lot of, there's a lot of theories about Glasgow being built on these kind of radial ley lines. And the ley lines were kind of routes and passes that were sort of frequented. And I wonder whether the motorways and ring roads will have the same imprint in the landscape that will look maybe ceremonial or strange to a future civilization or a future archaeologist, will look at it and maybe surmise that these were religious or they were ritualistic, or but yeah, I think those things will be left for a while in the landscape. I think these old structures will be big, great ridges of earthworks across the land. So I find that interesting, although depressing as well.
Classic ritual purposes. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayley. Next question. Some good comments. Meryl says, Catman reminds me of stories of Ratman, possibly his nemesis, I don't know. Who's supposed to be in Underpath in Southend-on-Sea. So hopefully Catman and Ratman will never ever meet. Next question is from Tabiko Flying Stone. If you're there, Tabiko, or if you're hovering about.
Hello, hi, thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing all your explorations and your findings. I was just wondering, like, in all your explorations, do you ever notice yourself start to like interact like in a sort of ritualistic manner with the spaces, or that you're producing artifacts or leave behinds, like intentionally or otherwise? Like, sort of, are you becoming part of, like, you know, this sort of folklore of these spaces yourself without really like realizing it or not while you're exploring them?
I think so. I think in me telling the story about the place, because I'm interested when someone tells a story, if it's a rumor or a legend or something, or just to freak someone out, that then enshrines that as a story, and that becomes a thing itself, separate from the place. So I think all the storytellers are doing that. Yeah, I completely think I'm contributing to the mythology, for good or bad. It was the same that happened in my first book, Marshland, where there were stories of headless bears and things in the marshes, where I started adding my own as well, based on the kind of spooky feelings that I was getting when I was there. There's a lot of kind of accidental stuff that happens in these walks, where just a confluence of light and atmosphere and noise can make you feel like something's happening, and you write that and you effectively create the story, and then maybe someone else reads it and they get the same feeling when they go to it. It's a bit like the estate in Grimsby. When I went there, because my head was so full of these stories, it really did feel like every bit of that estate was a clue to these phantasmagorical incidences, but really it wasn't. It was sort of in my imagination. But then is it? I mean, that's the thing. So I think so, and I think that when you go into a massive under a flyover, this huge slab of concrete and these huge pillars, they work in your mind a little bit like cathedrals, and I think you leave stuff behind, a little bit of your emotion behind with them. And you're obviously part of the story, because I keep talking about weird characters shuffling around these places, but what am I with my mobile phone taking notes? I guess someone could be looking at me thinking I'm part of the oddball nature of this structure as well.
Yeah, maybe kind of like a wandering bardic figure of sorts, really, for like these spaces.
Yeah, maybe all the people I see in the underpass are all psychogeographers.
Yeah, don't encourage him. Thank you. I'm going to read out a question from Zoe Chan. She's wondering if the spaces you talk about, did you experience them just in the day or in the night as well? And if yes, did they take on a different persona?
Mainly in the day, because I've got kids and a dog, and but not always. So I would go out and do these field trips. But yeah, sometimes at night they do. Well, they definitely do. And everything. The biggest experience I had, the biggest change of all of them was dusk. So when I went, there was twice I drove down ostensibly haunted road, Stockbridge bypass around Sheffield, and also up in Scotland as well. I think it's 89, I can't remember which one it was now. Anyway, there was as I did it, it was dusk and it was spectral as hell. And I felt all sorts of resonances and the kind of strange mists and the pylons poking over the cloud line, and it was weird. And so I think for me, dusk was the most fertile. But that's in folklore. That's the thin time of day, between the threshold between day and night. So I think that was the spookiest, and that's the most evocative time to walk around the place.
Cool, thanks for that. Gabrielle Turner has the next question.
Hi, sorry, this is not Gabrielle, this is her partner, Ben. Hi, really enjoyed the talk, thank you very much. So from what you were talking about, obviously the interaction has been between sort of human and landscape, and I was just quite interested in the interaction beyond or between sort of animal and landscape as well, and just wondering whether you'd experienced any interesting or sort of difficult interactions between animal and these kinds of liminal spaces that you've been talking about.
Only through no, not a lot. I mean, what I did was I was kind of focusing on the human in this, which again is this is why maybe for a future project I want to broaden it, but only in the sense that where I was, where you go to edgeland, obviously there's a lot of foxes and sort of dumping sites and kind of rats, and there's this kind of what you would call the edgeland wildlife, you know, the scavengers and things. So there's certainly a proliferation of that, and that was the same when I did car park life as well. So that was basically the nature of the edge of the car park. So those are the things I noticed. But a lot of the structures that I talk about, I do write about the fact that they cause massive ecological damage. And I think if I was to investigate that, there would be something to say there. There's this, for example, one of the places I look at is an industrial estate or industrial area up in Hull called the Barnston Drain. And that was a place where the last enclaves of wolves in Britain were, and before they were completely wiped out. And this is also a hotspot for werewolf sightings. So one of the things I saw, there was a werewolf in this industrial estate. It ate an Alsatian and leapt over a fence like Spring-Heel Jack. And a werewolf expert suggested that this was some kind of remnant of our ecological crime, like this was a guilt manifesting for the wiping out of species. So I think there's something to be talked about, certainly in modern folklore terms, about the way that our structures have overlaid what came before, and the ghosts of nature may be haunting us as well as humans.
Thank you. I love that you know a werewolf expert, and also, what's your favourite service station? Was the second part to that question.
Well, I'm going to say Fortin just because of the henge and the weird space. Yeah, I think that one was quite special for me, because I remember I described in the book stopping at that one when I was driving down the M6, and my friend's car went on the blink as we were driving. We thought we were going to die, and that was the service station. I sat there with clutching a coffee with a shake. So yeah, I think, but we all have the ones that we stop off on our way to see grandparents or old friends. So I guess we all have them. They in themselves, I guess, they're not interesting, but those memories overlay, and they become, when you pull in and you kind of recognise them, you feel warm, I think.
Thank you.
Fleet services, to be honest. Ray service station, I always used to stop there when I went hunt sabbing. There's a few people asking questions. I know there's some people with comments as well. Lee Boyd, you could ask a question if you wanted to, mate. The next question up is from David Mountain, possibly not a real mountain. It's got a question.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for the talk. It's just a question about, you showed the picture of the roundabout with the sort of obelisks in the middle. Yeah. And I've been looking into, I lived in Milton Keynes for a little while. And I learned that like the planners in the 60s and 70s there were really interested in you know, Stonehenge like sites, kind of mystical kind of thinking in their planning. So all the different roads in central Milton Keynes are named after like Avebury, Silbury. There's a real kind of like, so I'm wondering if there's much difference between sort of rediscovering planned psychogeography and then this like more kind of unintentional work on, say, like retail parks, if planning and government kind of makes much of a difference for you.
Well, there's I think John Higgs in Watling Street talks about Milton Keynes being laid out on this sort of solar plane thing so that the sun rises at one end. There's a guy called Ken Brophy, he does the he's a urban archaeologist, and he looks at a lot of these overlays between modern structures and the past, and how they're using the same kind of resonances, and there's links between the two. And there's all sorts of, in the book I talk about the fable of Telford's roundabout system, which was supposedly the town planners left their coffee when they had a massive meeting on for ages, they left their coffee mugs on the map, and those maps created coffee ring stains, and those stains became the roundabouts. So there was all this chaotic casting of the runes system for creating the Telford things. There's a lot of this stuff going on, like whether things are sometimes deliberate. Cribs Causeway retail park, the roundabouts have got some kind of narrative. Someone suggested that they're all parts of the anatomy. There's a penis, a breast, an anus, and they've all got the same these structures. When you look at them, you could say that they also have Neolithic overtones, or these ideas of standing stones and future structures and sculptures. I don't know whether it's planned or chaotic. So sometimes you wonder whether you're reading the landscape and coming up with these stories, or whether there's some kind of art, that's what they're doing, and maybe planners are nodding to the past and nodding to these structures because they know that it's how humans respond to them, and there is some kind of psychological effect.
Yeah, Kevin Brophy is in the house, and he says in the chat that the Barfage Henge was reconstructed as part of a council planning initiative to help retain the heritage of the new town. And then he says afterwards, a bit Thanos-like, and I am the urban prehistorian.
Yes, he's the man. I'll recommend his stuff if anyone wants to look into it a bit more.
We hope to book him one day. Next question is Amelia Hudson. Amelia, you had a question too.
Yeah, it's a bit more of a prosaic one than some of the recent ones. Thank you very much for the talk, by the way. My question is, do you ever get scared in these unexpected places, or do you avoid feeling scared by focusing on the resonance and the meaning and the history and so on?
I guess I've got a bit of, I guess I've got sort of certain white male privilege a little bit with these things, because I can kind of walk around them and not really be bothered. But I didn't really feel that scared, no. But I've done, Marshland, my first book, I was terrified all the time. I got quite jumpy. I'm just jumpy generally, and I've put that into the book. So I'm more interested in horror, and a lot of some of my short stories that I write, I take those feelings of paranoia and insecurity when I'm in these places and kind of push it to sort of suggest that there's something else going on under the surface or some kind of consciousness. So I do feel that I'm generally jumpy walking around. Like there's one place that has a Matalan car park that had a hole in it. So I went through into this strange edge bit that had strange piles of mouldering clothes, and I could hear something crackle in the and I ran basically. So yeah, I do get jumpy, but I think it's okay. I think sometimes these things like service stations, they feel quite kind of safe in a way, but sometimes I feel frightened. I mean, it depends on my mood.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lou Boyd, you are up once you're ready.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Lovely, great, brilliant. Thanks for that talk. Yeah, I was just, you mentioned when you were talking about Bethlehem about kind of things being repurposed and added upon, and we're sort of reaching a point in British architecture and development now where a lot of the Victorian and Edwardian sort of new builds, or like let's say sports stadiums, are now becoming obsolete, and they're repurposing them and building on them. Did you look at like when something relatively modern becomes, you know, the next phase of its life, and just within that, you know, there's, particularly in football stadium, there's a big argument about how sacred they are because a lot of people have ashes scattered on them, so that affects the repurposing. Did you look at any of that or experience that?
A little bit, yeah. For example, in Bromley by Bow, there's the gasworks there, which is the former gasworks, and there's a memorial garden. It was originally for soldiers who worked at the gasworks who died, but then became a memorial. There's a memorial there for a girl who died there in the 90s, and yet now it's the sort of middle of this Amazon redistribution centre. You've got this real conflict between this area that was an industrial estate, industrial area that became sort of enshrined as a memorial, but then this new layer has come on where it's now a big trading estate, and then those things they're at conflicts. I mean, what happens to the memorial garden, and how do those things correspond? So I think a lot of the places, some of the industrial areas, they're between preservation and not. And certainly, I think some of the places like car parks and things where events and incidents happens, there's people trying to protect. Like I don't know about the stadiums, but certainly multi-story car parks. Huge campaigns to protect them, saying that they're culturally important, that they're aesthetically important, and that they're places that things have happened and they should be kept. So I think there's a constant tussle with that kind of thing. Hospitals in particular, they're less sort of cherished, and people don't talk about on this, but they're very improvised. So you've got the Victorian, or the Georgian and Victorian extensions of the Georgian, and you've got the mid-20th century stuff, and you've got they're constantly being improvised and bits plugged in and redeveloped. So they're really, truly chaotic, weird spaces where the modern's constantly being upgraded. They're constantly being upgraded for new technologies and new health and safety, so that they're quite strange in that way. They're sort of improvised spaces for
them. Thanks. Rose Davison has a similar question. Rose put it in the chat, but if you'd like us to open your microphone, we're going to do that so you can speak. I'll give you a minute, because we talked about werewolves earlier on. Modern werewolves, the idea of walking dogs, is a thing now. There was a werewolf sighting near where I live at Camberwell New Cemetery a few years ago that hit the headlines recently. So the werewolves are out there. Also, I don't know if everyone can hear it. I'm currently being circled by a helicopter. So the Lewisham shed is under attack. So let's move on to Rose. Are you ready to ask your question? Rose Davison?
Don't think her mic's working.
Oh, okay, thank you, Harriet, that must have been. No problem. What Rose asked was, is similar to Lou's question. Is there some connection between these brutalist and modernist structures having forms similar to standing stones, stroke Neolithic forms? I wonder if mock Tudor buildings would resonate in the same primitive way.
I definitely think they've definitely got resonance, and I think they've definitely they've become embraced and they're part of. We've grown up. A lot of people now who are alive only remember these landscapes, and the Tudor landscape or the Tudor sort of streets are sort of old heritage places that we go and visit, like chocolate box things there. But where the structures like, I don't know, Dungeness or the local shopping centre are, where all the stuff happened to us. We grew up and we had these rites of passage and we had these ideas and our inspirations. They whether we like them or not, they affected us. They're like this ghostly, haunting presence that affects our imaginations. And I think that's why the sites of horror and myth locations change. So what those old Tudor things don't really are where we place horror now. That's where you wouldn't probably invite horror there. Ever since the sort of Walking Dead sort of thing, you know, it's all shopping centres, and it was the sort of sites of capitalism became the sites of horror from the 70s onwards, with zombie films particularly. And I think that's what's happening ongoing, I think, with the structures we know. And really these brutalist structures are historical now, yeah. And that's not what's being built. So a lot of people complain about the new shopping centres or houses because of their materials and their flimsiness. And maybe they're right, but I wonder what we'll see them like in 50 years' time.
Indeed. I think that is it for questions and comments, everyone. Really, yeah, I'm sorry, 2 rows. Never mind. Really appreciate everyone's input and everyone coming along. It's brilliant and inspiring talk, Gareth. It will be available on YouTube too soon. Thanks, Harriet. I need to just talk and not read things. So thank you very much, Gareth. Great talk. Thanks for everyone's input. It's been really interesting and inspiring, and let's all go out exploring, which is kind of what I've kind of decided on doing Reweirding as a frame to put all this through. Conway Hall are doing other events in the next few weeks. We're doing one on mermaids, one on spiritualism, and another one on, now that we have your attention, the new politics that is emerging in Britain at a grassroots level. Go check out our website. I thoroughly recommend that. We've got some great stuff out there. Thank you, Gareth. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you, Harriet, for helping out. And good evening. Happy trails, everyone. Thanks a lot.